In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps commissioned an internal study. The purpose of the study was not to evaluate pilot training methods or aircraft performance or combat readiness. The purpose was to answer a specific question that someone in a position of authority considered worth the time and resources of a formal investigation. The question was whether Black Americans were mentally and physically capable of flying military aircraft. The study concluded that they were not. It cited no meaningful evidence. It referenced no rigorous testing. It drew on the kind of assumptions that were so embedded in the institutional culture of the American military at that time that they were treated as conclusions rather than prejudices. The report was accepted, filed, and used to justify a policy that was already in place before the study began. Black men would not fly for the United States Army. The science, such as it was, had confirmed what the institution had already decided. The men who would eventually prove that conclusion catastrophically wrong were, at the moment that report was being written, going about the ordinary business of their lives in a country that had constructed elaborate systems to limit what those lives could contain. They were students at historically Black colleges, workers in cities where the best jobs were unavailable to them regardless of qualification, young men who had grown up watching the sky and reading about aviation and understanding, without needing to be told explicitly that the cockpit of a military aircraft was one of the many spaces American society had decided they had no business occupying. Some of them had already applied to the Army Air Corps and been rejected. The rejection letters were polite and bureaucratic and said nothing honest about the actual reason for the decision. To understand the specific nature of the barrier these men faced, you have to understand how comprehensively the American military was segregated in 1940. Segregation in the armed forces was not informal or inconsistent. It was policy, codified and enforced at every level of the institutional structure. Black soldiers served in separate units, trained in separate facilities, ate in separate dining halls, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. The logic offered to justify this arrangement varied depending on who was making the argument. Sometimes it was framed as a practical necessity, the claim that integration would damage unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Sometimes it relied on the pseudoscientific racism that the Army study exemplified. Sometimes it was simply asserted as the natural order of things by men who had never examined that assertion and saw no reason to start. What made aviation a particularly charged arena for this conflict was the cultural status that pilots held in American society during this period. The decades between the Wright brothers and the Second World War had transformed the aviator into something approaching a national symbol. Lindbergh's transatlantic crossing, the barnstormers, the air mail pilots, the early military flyers, all of them had contributed to an image of the pilot as the embodiment of a particular American ideal. Courage, technical mastery, individual excellence, operating within a framework of national service. It was an image that was implicitly and sometimes explicitly white, and the institutional resistance to Black pilots was inseparable from the resistance to disrupting that image. The political pressure that eventually cracked this resistance came from multiple directions simultaneously. The NAACP had been pushing for Black inclusion in the military aviation program for years before the war began. Black newspapers, particularly the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, covered the exclusion extensively and kept public attention on it in a way that created sustained pressure on elected officials. Some members of Congress, responding to constituents and to the broader argument that a nation fighting fascism abroad could not indefinitely justify racial exclusion at home, began asking uncomfortable questions of the War Department. And Eleanor Roosevelt, whose influence on her husband's administration was real if never formally defined, took a personal interest in the question that translated into direct pressure on military leadership. The result of this pressure was not a genuine conversion of institutional belief. The Army Air Corps did not suddenly conclude that its previous assessment had been wrong. What it did was create a compromise that was designed, at least by some of its architects, to fail on its own terms. A training program for Black pilots would be established. It would be located at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, deep in the segregated South, physically isolated from the rest of the Army Air Force's training infrastructure. It would be given resources that reflected the institution's expectation that the program would produce limited results. And if those limited results confirmed the existing prejudice, the experiment could be quietly concluded and the policy maintained on the basis of evidence rather than assumption. What the architects of this compromise did not account for was the quality of the men who would arrive at Tuskegee. They came with college degrees at a time when most military recruits had not finished high school. They came having already accumulated flight hours in civilian programs. They came with the specific intensity of people who understood that they were not simply training to fly. They were training to disprove something. Every examination passed, every flight completed, every standard met was an argument against the report that had said they couldn't do it. They understood this with a clarity that gave their training a dimension that went beyond the professional. They were not just becoming pilots. They were dismantling, one flight at a time, the institutional lie that had been told about them. The instructors assigned to Tuskegee were a mix of black civilian pilots with significant experience, military personnel whose attitudes toward the program varied widely, and white officers who ranged from genuinely committed to the success of the training to openly hostile to its existence. The cadets navigated this environment with a discipline that would become characteristic of the unit. Complaints were made through proper channels. Performance on every measurable standard was prioritized above every other consideration. The argument being made was not political, it was aeronautical, and it was being made every day in the cockpit of a Stearman biplane over the red clay fields of Alabama. By the time the first class completed training, something had already been established that the 1940 Army study had declared impossible. Black men had learned to fly military aircraft to the standard required for combat service. The question of whether they would be allowed to prove what that meant in actual combat was still to be answered. But the first premise of the institutional argument against them had been tested, and it had failed. The men who would become the Tuskegee Airmen were ready. What remained was whether the country that had trained them would find the courage to use them. The town of Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941 was not a place that the United States Army Air Corps would have chosen for a training facility under normal circumstances. It was small, isolated, and located in the heart of a region where the social and legal architecture of racial segregation was most thoroughly developed and most vigorously defended. The roads leading to the proposed airfield site were unpaved. The infrastructure required to support a military aviation training program did not exist. The nearest facilities that could provide support services were in Montgomery, an hour away. By virtually every practical metric, it was the wrong location for what was being attempted. It was, however, the right location for what the Army actually intended. The choice of Tuskegee was not accidental, and it was not primarily driven by practical considerations. It was driven by the desire to place the program as far as possible from the rest of the military aviation training infrastructure, to ensure that even if the experiment produced qualified pilots, those pilots would remain physically and institutionally separated from the white units they were theoretically being trained to support. Tuskegee Institute, the historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington, was nearby and provided a civilian connection that gave the location a surface plausibility. But the isolation was the point. If the program failed, it would fail quietly without disrupting the broader training system. If it succeeded, the success could be contained. The men who arrived to build Tuskegee Army Airfield did so knowing the context. Many of them had read the coverage in the black press. They understood that the program had been established under political pressure rather than institutional conviction, and that the expectation in many quarters was that they would wash out in sufficient numbers to justify the original policy. This understanding produced not demoralization, but a specific kind of determination that permeated the program from its earliest days. The base would be built, the training would be completed, the standards would be met, and the argument would be settled not with words, but with performance. The physical construction of the airfield involved black workers and engineers who built in the Alabama heat a facility that would have to function as a first-class military training installation, regardless of what the institution expected of it. Runways were laid, hangars were constructed, administrative buildings went up. The work was done with an attention to quality that reflected the understanding that every aspect of the program would be scrutinized for evidence that confirmed the prejudice it was designed to challenge. There was no room for the kind of shortcuts that might have been acceptable elsewhere, because anything less than complete professionalism would be used against them. The curriculum at Tuskegee matched the Army Air Force's standard program with additions that reflected the specific pressures the cadets were operating under. Academic instruction covered meteorology, navigation, aircraft mechanics, and military theory at a level that the instructors, many of whom were themselves pushing against institutional resistance, refused to compromise. Ground school was rigorous in a way that produced pilots who understood their aircraft not just as machines to be operated, but as systems to be understood. This depth of knowledge would prove operationally significant later, but its immediate function was to ensure that no graduate of the Tuskegee program could be dismissed on grounds of inadequate preparation. The flight training itself proceeded in stages that mirrored the broader Army Air Force's program. Primary training in open cockpit biplanes established the fundamental skills. Basic training in more powerful aircraft developed them. Advanced training in high-performance planes prepared cadets for the specific aircraft they would fly in combat. At each stage, the washout rate was watched carefully by people on both sides of the institutional argument. Those who expected the program to fail looked for the numbers that would confirm their expectations. Those who had fought to create the program looked for the numbers that would justify continuing it. The cadets themselves focused on the only number that mattered to them, which was the number of their graduating class. The social environment surrounding the base presented its own set of challenges that existed entirely outside the training curriculum. Tuskegee was in Alabama. The laws and customs of the Jim Crow South applied with full force in the town and on the roads and in the establishments surrounding the base. Officers who had earned their rank through the same process as their white counterparts could not eat in the same restaurants. Enlisted men who had volunteered to serve their country faced the daily experience of being treated as less than citizens in the country they had volunteered to defend. The psychological weight of this context was not separate from the training. It was present in every aspect of it, a constant reminder of what was at stake and why performance mattered in a way that went beyond military professionalism. The commanding officer of Tuskegee Army Airfield for much of its formative period was Colonel Noel Parrish, a white officer from the South whose attitude toward the program was more complicated and ultimately more supportive than most of his institutional peers. Parrish believed that the men training at Tuskegee were capable of becoming first-rate combat pilots, and said so in reports and correspondence that put him at odds with significant portions of Army Air Force's leadership. He pushed for better equipment, better facilities, and combat assignments that would allow his pilots to demonstrate what they had been trained to do. His advocacy was not ideological in the way that later generations might understand it. It was professional. He had seen what the men at Tuskegee could do, and he believed that not using them in combat was a waste of military capability that the country could not afford. By early 1943, the first operational unit drawn from the Tuskegee program, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was ready for combat deployment. The training had been completed. The standards had been met. The argument that black men could not learn to fly military aircraft had been tested against actual evidence and had not survived the test. What remained was the larger argument, the one that could only be answered in the sky over North Africa and later over Europe, about whether the men who had been told they were not good enough to fly could prove themselves against an enemy that did not share the American military's doubts about their capability. That answer was coming, and it would not be what the institution expected. On the morning of June 9, 1943, a formation of P-40 Warhawks from the 99th Pursuit Squadron crossed the coastline of Sicily at altitude and began their attack on the German-held airfield at Pantelleria. It was not the first mission the 99th had flown since arriving in North Africa in April. There had been escort missions and patrol flights, and the gradual accumulation of combat hours that transforms trained pilots into experienced ones. But the Pantelleria campaign represented something different. It was the sustained operational test that would determine whether the arguments made about the Tuskegee pilots in Washington conference rooms and Army Air Forces headquarters bore any relationship to what these men could actually do in combat. The men flying those missions understood the stakes with a precision that their white counterparts did not share. For a pilot from a conventional unit, a successful mission was a successful mission. It advanced the campaign and brought him one step closer to completing his tour. For the pilots of the 99th, every successful mission was also evidence in an argument that was still being actively made against them at the highest levels of the military establishment. They were not flying only against the Germans. They were flying against the accumulated weight of institutional prejudice that had tried to keep them on the ground and was still looking for reasons to put them back there. Those reasons were not difficult to find for people determined to look for them. The 99th early performance in North Africa was solid, but not spectacular by the metrics that the Army Air Forces used to evaluate fighter units. The squadron was still developing the unit cohesion and tactical fluency that comes only from sustained combat experience. Transition from training to actual combat operations involves an adjustment period for every unit regardless of how thoroughly prepared they are individually. The 99th was going through that adjustment under conditions that offered no margin for the normal learning curve. Every casualty, every mission that produced less than optimal results was being watched and recorded by people who had already decided what the evidence meant. Colonel William Momia, commanding officer of the 33rd Fighter Group, under which the 99th initially operated, filed a report in the summer of 1943 that came close to ending the Tuskegee program before it had fully begun. The report assessed the 99th's combat performance as below standard and recommended that the squadron be withdrawn from combat operations and the broader program of training black combat pilots be reconsidered. The report was not a fabrication. It reflected a genuine assessment of performance data, but it was an assessment filtered through assumptions that shaped which data was considered significant and how it was interpreted. Units at comparable stages of combat experience regularly showed similar performance profiles. The difference was that for those units, the learning curve was understood as normal. For the 99th, it was presented as evidence of inherent limitation. The report moved through Army Air Forces channels and reached the point where a decision about the program's future was genuinely in question. The political intervention that followed came from the same coalition that had created the program, black press organizations, the NAACP, sympathetic members of Congress, and advocates within the Roosevelt administration who understood that withdrawing the 99th from combat on the basis of Momia's report would confirm the worst suspicions about the program's intentions. The decision was made to allow the 99th to continue and to evaluate its performance over a longer period and under more standardized conditions. What happened in January 1944 settled the argument in a way that no political intervention could have managed. During the Allied landings at Anzio on the Italian coast, the 99th was assigned to provide air cover for the beachhead. German air forces responded to the landings with sustained attacks, and the 99th found itself in the sustained, high-intensity aerial combat that its earlier North African deployment had not consistently provided. On January 27th and 28th, pilots of the 99th shot down 12 German aircraft in 2 days of fighting. The engagement was documented, witnessed by other Allied units operating in the same airspace, and impossible to dismiss or reinterpret. The 99th had performed at a level that matched or exceeded comparable white fighter units operating under similar conditions. The individual stories from those 2 days carry a quality that statistics cannot fully convey. These were men who had been told by the institution they were serving that they lacked the capability for what they were doing. They had trained in a facility built with the expectation of their failure. They had been evaluated by officers who approached their performance with assumptions already in place. And on those 2 January days over the Anzio beachhead, they flew with a precision and aggression that produced results the Army Air Forces could not explain away with the framework it had been using. The engagement was reported in the press, including the black newspapers that had covered the program since its beginning, and the coverage carried a specific emotional weight that reflected how much the men involved understood about what they had demonstrated. The broader 332nd Fighter Group, which incorporated the 99th and 3 additional squadrons trained at Tuskegee, was now assembled and operational. Under the command of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of social ostracism at the Academy as its only black cadet, and emerged from the experience with a discipline and determination that defined his leadership. The 332nd was preparing for the role that would make it historically significant. Escort missions over deep targets in Germany, protecting the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force against the Luftwaffe interceptors that had been killing bomber crews at a rate that was becoming strategically unsustainable. Davis had studied the problem of bomber escort with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. The standard practice among escort fighter units was to pursue German fighters aggressively when they were spotted, leaving the bomber formations temporarily unprotected in exchange for the tactical advantage of offensive engagement. This approach produced fighter kill numbers that looked good in after-action reports, but left bombers vulnerable during the periods when their escorts were engaged elsewhere. Davis made a different decision. The 332nd would stay with the bombers. Individual kills mattered less than the protection of the formation. The mission was escort, and that was what the mission would remain regardless of what tactical opportunities presented themselves. This decision would define the 332nd's legacy, and the bomber crews who flew deep into Germany under their protection were about to understand something that the Army Air Forces had spent years trying not to know. The men from Tuskegee were not just good enough to fly. They were among the best protection in the air war over Europe, and the German pilots who encountered them were going to find that out the hard way. The red paint went on the tails of the 332nd Fighter Group's aircraft in the spring of 1944, and it was not a subtle choice. Fighter units in the Mediterranean theater often marked their aircraft with distinctive colors and insignia for identification purposes, and the 332nd red tails served that practical function. But they served another function as well, one that the pilots who flew under that marking understood with complete clarity. The red tails were visible, they were memorable, they were the kind of marking that bomber crews, scanning the sky for their escort, would learn to recognize and to trust. And trust, in the context of deep escort missions over heavily defended German territory, was not an abstract quality. It was the difference between whether the men in those bombers came home. The relationship between escort fighters and the bomber crews they protected was one of the defining human dynamics of the air war over Europe. Bomber crews flew in formations that made them easier to defend collectively, but also made them predictable and visible targets for German interceptors. The losses among heavy bomber units during the sustained campaign against German industrial and military targets were severe enough to constitute a genuine strategic crisis by late 1943 and early 1944. On some missions, the loss rate among B-17 and B-24 crews exceeded 10%, a figure that meant statistically a crew had no realistic chance of completing a full tour. Men flew these missions knowing the mathematics, and they flew them anyway, which is a form of courage that deserves its own accounting. What bomber crews wanted from their escorts was simple and consistent. They wanted the fighters to stay close, not to range ahead chasing kills, not to dive after German planes spotted at a distance, not to pursue tactical opportunities that left the formation unprotected during the critical minutes when Luftwaffe interceptors made their runs. They wanted someone there, between them and whatever was coming. The complaint heard consistently from bomber crews throughout the air campaign was that their escorts left them. Pursuit of kills, which looked good on fighter pilots' records and their unit statistics, came at the cost of the protection the bombers needed most. Davis had understood this from his analysis of escort tactics before the 332nd flew its first deep mission. His decision to keep his pilots with the bombers rather than pursuing independent kills was not universally popular within his own unit. Fighter pilots trained for aerial combat naturally gravitated toward the offensive opportunities that German aircraft provided. Staying in formation while German fighters could be seen at a distance required a specific kind of discipline, the subordination of individual tactical instinct to collective mission priority. Davis demanded it, and the 332nd delivered it, mission after mission, in a consistency that bomber crews began to notice. The missions themselves were among the most demanding of the entire air war. Deep penetration raids into southern Germany, Austria, and Romania took the 332nd to the outer limits of their aircraft's range. The Plosti oil fields in Romania, which supplied a significant portion of Germany's aviation fuel, were among the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Missions to these targets flew through sustained anti-aircraft fire and faced interception by Luftwaffe units that were experienced, aggressive, and flying aircraft that were in many cases technically superior to the P-47s and later P-51s of the escort fighters. The engagement record of the 332nd on these missions became the statistical foundation of a claim that was extraordinary in the context of the air war. Over the course of their escort operations in 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group did not lose a single bomber to enemy fighter attack during the missions they escorted. The claim has been subject to historical scrutiny and some revision, with later research indicating that the record was not absolutely perfect. But the core reality that the 332nd performance in bomber protection was exceptional, measurably and significantly better than comparable units, has survived that scrutiny. Bomber crews who flew with the Red Tails knew it from their own experience before any statistics confirmed it. The accounts from bomber crews about what it meant to see the Red Tails in their formation have a specific character. Men who had flown missions where their escorts had disappeared in pursuit of kills, who had experienced the particular vulnerability of a bomber formation without fighter cover, described the Red Tails in language that was not complicated or analytical. They were glad to see them. They knew from experience and from the reports of other crews that when the Red Tails were your escort, they stayed. That knowledge changed something in how those missions felt, which in turn affected performance in ways that are difficult to quantify but were real. German Luftwaffe pilots encountered the 332nd in a context that gave them no particular reason to distinguish one Allied fighter unit from another except by performance. What they encountered was a unit that flew with discipline, maintained formation integrity, and engaged with an aggression that was focused and consistent. The specific aerial victories the 332nd achieved included the destruction of a German destroyer by strafing attack, the downing of advanced jet aircraft, including the Me-262, and sustained performance against veteran Luftwaffe interceptors that confirmed the quality of the pilots flying those red-tailed aircraft. The men flying those missions were doing so in a dual context that their white counterparts did not inhabit. Every mission was simultaneously a military operation and a demonstration. The argument about their capability was still being made in Washington and at Army Air Forces headquarters. Reports were still being written that would shape policy about the future of Black Americans in military aviation. The pilots of the 332nd were aware of this in the way that people are aware of something that has been present throughout their entire engagement with an institution. It was background, but it was always there, and they flew with the specific quality of people who understood that their performance was not only their own business. By the late summer of 1944, the Red Tails had become known among the bomber groups of the 15th Air Force in a way that reflected genuine operational reputation rather than novelty. Crews requested the 332nd as their escort. The request was not always honored, logistics and scheduling being what they are in the management of a large air force. But the fact that it was made, consistently and by crews with direct experience of what it meant to fly deep into Germany, was a form of recognition that no official report had yet provided. The men who had been told they were not capable of flying military aircraft had become the escort that other pilots wanted protecting them. Germany had not been warned, but Germany had noticed. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 15,000 individual sorties. They had completed over 1,500 missions. They had destroyed more than 260 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. They had received more than 850 medals and commendations. They had escorted bomber formations deep into the heart of Germany and brought those bombers home at a rate that the rest of the 15th Air Force could not match. By any objective measure of military performance, the Tuskegee Airmen had not just met the standard that had been set for them. They had exceeded it in ways that were documented, witnessed, and impossible to honestly dispute. Then they came home, and America, the country they had fought for and distinguished themselves in service of, was largely unchanged in its relationship to the men who had done these things. The buses in the South still had the same seats in the back. The lunch counters in Alabama still had the same policies. The airports and train stations and hotels that the veterans passed through on their way home still operated under the same rules that had applied when they left. The uniform they wore, which represented service at the highest level of documented military achievement, did not alter those rules. The medals they carried did not alter them. The records they had compiled over 2 years of combat operations in the Mediterranean theater did not alter them. This reality was not a surprise to the men who returned. They had not gone to war with illusions about what would be waiting for them when they came back. The same newspapers that had covered their training and their combat record had also covered the race riots in Detroit in 1943, the continued exclusion of black veterans from GI Bill benefits in many parts of the country, the ongoing operation of a legal and social system that treated their service as separate from the rights that service was supposed to affirm. They returned to this context with the specific combination of exhaustion and clarity that extended combat produces, and they found it exactly as they had expected. The demobilization process itself carried its own indignities. Veterans were processed through facilities where segregation remained the operating procedure. Men who had commanded other men in combat, who had made decisions under fire that determined whether those under their command lived or died, returned to a military system that still evaluated them through the lens of the same assumptions the Tuskegee program had been designed to confirm. The decorations were real. The records were real. The institutional framework surrounding them had not fundamentally changed. Benjamin Davis returned from Europe to face an Army Air Forces that was simultaneously proud of the 332nd record and uncertain what to do with it. The evidence the Tuskegee program had produced was, in the most literal sense, overwhelming. The argument that black Americans could not perform at the level required for military aviation had been tested against sustained combat operations and had failed completely. The question of what followed from that failure was not being answered with the urgency that the evidence suggested it deserved. Davis pushed through official channels and through the discipline that had characterized his approach to every institutional obstacle since West Point, for the recognition and policy changes that the record justified. The broader veteran community that the Tuskegee Airmen returned to was engaged in its own confrontation with the gap between wartime service and peacetime reality. Black veterans across all branches who had served in segregated units had fought in the Pacific and in Europe, and in every theater the war encompassed, returned to find that the democratic principles articulated as the war's justification remained theoretical in their application to black Americans. The hypocrisy was not subtle, and it was not lost on men who had spent years defending a country that continued to deny them its fundamental protections. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen responded to this context by becoming directly involved in the civil rights organizing that would eventually produce the legal and social changes of the following decades. The skills and discipline they had developed in the military, the experience of functioning within institutions, and pushing against their limits through consistent performance and persistent advocacy, translated directly into the demands of sustained civil rights work. Others channeled their capabilities into professional and academic careers in a changed post-war economy where Black veterans with documented skills and the GI Bill, however unevenly applied, had somewhat greater access than their predecessors. Others carried the weight of the transition from combat to civilian life, with the specific difficulty that veterans have always faced, and that the additional burden of returning to a segregated society compounded. The formal recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's contribution took decades to arrive. The desegregation of the United States military, ordered by President Truman in 1948 through Executive Order 9981, was in part a product of the evidence that the Tuskegee program had produced. The argument that integration would damage military effectiveness had been tested in the most direct possible way against actual performance data, and the data had not supported the argument. Truman's order did not cite the Tuskegee Airmen specifically, but the political and evidential context that made it possible had been built substantially by what they had demonstrated. The Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the Tuskegee Airmen in 2007 came 60 years after the war ended. The ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda was attended by surviving members of the unit, men in their 80s and 90s, who received the recognition in a setting that reflected how completely the public understanding of their achievement had been revised from the institutional assessment that had greeted it in 1945. The distance between those two moments, between the veterans who came home to unchanged segregation and the men who received a Congressional Gold Medal in the Capitol, is a measure of something that takes a long time to name precisely. What the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated was not only that Black Americans could fly military aircraft to the highest standard of combat performance. That was the specific argument their service answered, and they answered it completely. What they demonstrated more broadly was something about the relationship between institutional prejudice and human capability, about what happens when a system built on false assumptions is confronted with sustained, documented, irrefutable evidence of its own error. The system does not collapse immediately. It resists and adjusts and finds new rationalizations, but the evidence accumulates. And eventually, across a span of years and decades that requires patience that most people should not have been asked to maintain, the truth of the record asserts itself. The red tails crossed the sky over Germany and came home. The men who flew them deserved better than what they returned to. They knew it and said so when asked, without bitterness that would have been entirely justified and without the pretense that the country had fully honored what they had given it. They had done the job. They had done it at a level that the most hostile assessment of their capability had declared impossible. And in doing so, they had left behind a record that the institution could ignore in 1945, but could not ultimately erase. Wars are fought in the sky and on the ground, and in the numbers that document what actually happened. In every one of those places, the Tuskegee Airmen had won.